was after after one of the EPQ sessions. I come out, I sit down, and a friend joins me. And we were on the bus, we were getting home, a bit of traffic, but we had time to speak. And what ended up happening was that I remember some kind of tidbit, factoid, something of the sort. I don't even remember where I found it. But it was that apparently the billboards in Times Square, the massive billboards seen across in New York City that are way beyond in comparison to the size of a regular person, they're presented not so you have your primary ocular attention on them. It's meant to be for your peripheral vision, because apparently the intake of information from advertisements within your peripheral vision is stronger and more persuasive. But I thought that was quite interesting. So I wanted to explore different topics. So I wanted to look at body image. What kind of ads are shown in the media? What kind of ads are shown in general advertising? Because body image is an incredibly common thing that people advertise. You see the ideas of models. You see the ideas of people trying on clothes. You see people trying and wearing things. It's all in a bit to get you to wear the clothes, but it comes with an unfortunate side effect of starting to feel of an inferiority complex with it. You don't feel as good compared to everybody else because you're experiencing what would have been the upper echelon of traditional or stereotypical beauty at the time. Another thing I wanted to explore was influencers, because like social media, there are influences everywhere. Right now, technically, by definition, I am influencing you to have an interest in my EPQ, which is, the idea is that where there's advertising, there is influence. And influencers are a key living human demographic tool to garner it. Another thing I wanted to look at was the types of advertising. There are genuinely so many. And the little diagram here does not even go to scratch the surface. Because there's advertisements between television shows, there is ads between streaming services, there's pop-up ads, there's more actual in-person ads as well. You have billboards, small postage areas where you have signs, other kinds of advertising. But one that isn't really spoken about too much is word of mouth advertising. And I believe that's a very powerful tool that is often neglected, and it's not talked about quite often. And I believe that when putting all of these three into tandem and applying it to the copy of social media, you actually get an incredibly good storm brewing, which allows you to kind of come up with ideas, come up with theories, come up with foundational questions like, oh, how is body image presented with influencers with certain types of advertising on social media? And one of my original questions that I actually didn't put down, which looking back at it I should have, is that I wanted to originally explore with a lot of my preliminary research was looking at the effects of body image and the types of advertising that influencers do on social media. Because it's particularly predominant in more women-oriented spaces, especially on social media. There's unrealistic beauty standards seen in the makeup industry. And because social media is way more incredibly accessible to the common person, it's incredibly easy to see how one person can be influenced with such a constant media stream of information to try and experience this idea of beauty. And unfortunately, experiencing the negatives and drawbacks as well. But instead, I actually rejected it, and I wanted to talk about something that's not talked about too much. The fear of missing out, also known as FOMO. And the topic itself, while incredibly interesting, is a lot more diffuse. A lot of people know what FOMO is, but do they actually know how to quantify it? Well, the traditional definition for FOMO is it's a fear or anxiety that comes with the thought of missing out on an activity that somebody else is having. And another key aspect of it is that FOMO itself isn't a new term. It's more of a new word to describe a common feeling that humans experience due to us being naturally social animals. And the amount of FOMO that someone experiences is more of a diathesis stress example. The amount of FOMO that someone experiences from an event differs from person to person, and it depends on how socially connected you are from one person to another group. And I think that was quite interesting. And it was, it's been relatively well researched. FOMO itself has been linked to drive over usage of social media and is one of the preliminary causes of social media addiction, which is another very prevalent, heavy issue in today's society. But another thing that I wanted to talk about was that even though in these last few points I've summarized and said that FOMO is quite bad, or at least through these aspects, because you see the word addiction, you see something bad, but FOMO actually has its positive applications. In groups with lower self-esteem, FOMO has been used as an adequate tool to raise self-esteem, which has actually led to a bit of a juxtaposition in both thoughts and terminologies. FOMO is bad because it has certain effects, but it can also drive positive interactions as well. And I want to talk about the aims of my research as well, because the question I settled on was looking at how the FOMO is exploited. That already brings up the negative connotations. And my first preliminary aim was to establish if there were ties between FOMO, influencers, and the way that influencers operate on social media, along with its mental health effects, which I believe I achieved. I believe I actually established the original primary aim very well within the first half of my essay. I believe it was very strong. But the secondary aim is where I falter a bit. I wanted to establish if social media influencers are exploiting the weaknesses that FOMO imposes on a person to make as much money as possible. And while I do believe I've done a decent job of it, I don't think I've gone into enough overall depth. But it's rather hard with the research, particularly on looking at more sociological aspects, because an influencer is a person, and of course we're trying to get information from a person without an external higher up force. You're not really going to have an easy time doing it, which is where we move on to my research. My research was heavily dominated by secondary data. I used journals, I used articles, and I had used YouTube videos. Basically, all independent research conducted by several parties to provide a culmination aspect. And I was actually going to do some primary research, but decided against it, as at the time I was planning to do a survey to see if people were more susceptible to the perception of ads, which I rejected due to it being close to the Christmas time. And when Christmas rolls around, there are very, very, very significant effects on how people change their behavior. People are less likely to admit that they are influenced because it makes them feel guilty about things. They wanted to get a gift for someone because it was limited time. That might have had an effect on the responses. So I decided against it and thought maybe doing it in January might have been a better idea. But by then, I had actually long forgotten and had moved on with the topic, which honestly would have been nice and would have been something I should have changed. But the work itself was sourced from primary research by, most notably the work by Dr. Andrew K. Shabilsky. And he is one of the first preliminary instances of the fear of missing out being recorded in such scientific journals and within such detail. He is one of the people who created the FOMO scale, which is the perception of how much FOMO someone experiences with certain events. And there are several parts of works that were linked and recommended when I actually reached out to Dr. Shabilsky, which is how I acquired some of this research. And there were some websites and blog articles that I had included to explain more of the sociological aspects. Because while psychology is heavily ingrained in the topics of focusing on the numbers, the statistics, and the big heavy words that explain not a lot, the websites and the blog articles did a great job of chunking down the content while still retaining the scientific basis with some of them and applying it to a more of an easy to understand aspect, which goes to explain that the sociological aspects are a lot easier to digest. But not all good is bad, and not all bad is good. But we need to talk about the issues. I had several issues with my research. Most notably, a lot of them were hidden behind paywalls. And while doing the EPQ, I did learn that I am a massive advocate for freedom of access of information. And it's a workaround that I actually found was that, some advice that a friend gave me who was actually working on their university dissertation at the time, was to just reach out, send them an email, send the primary researcher an email to see if they will just give you the work without having to spend the money on the publication or to send it to the publisher.